Hi, Zach.
Hello, Lucas.
Very, very professional of us to do that. I'm really happy to have this conversation with you. I reached out to you just for people listening or watching this uh, because of your article that you wrote for your Unbounded Capital um, website, but then that got published on CoinGeek, where you talk about personal sovereignty and individual freedom, and why that is actually a very deep foundation on why you believe in Bitcoin. And I would love to talk to you about that. What does personal freedom mean? What does sovereignty mean? And why do you see Bitcoin as a foundation that can actually enable more of that in the world? So that's kind of the conversation I would love to have with you today. Do you already have something to say just based on
No,
that
let's
introduction?
let's 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 do it. Obviously, I have a lot to say and a lot
Yeah.
on this. It's while I only published the article recently, I've been thinking about this for many years, and this article was kind of more of a process of really diving in, deep and early to kind of what motivated me from a young age, and just seeing if there was a thread to now, and then finding that thread, and then just kind of almost affirming to myself why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I'm happy to say it has been affirmed, and I really feel like I'm doing my life's work here, and feel very lucky to have kind of found Bitcoin early.
Yeah, I can get that because for me personally, I'm originally coming from a different field, more psychological. So I work with people psychologically, but the value I have in that is actually allowing people to have freedom, allowing people to have sovereignty over their life, and actually seeing how often personal struggles are keeping us from making the choices that we actually want to make, and helping them work through that. So that's why I resonated so much with your article. And I've just made a few drawings. So whoever's watching this, there are drawings here because I wanted to really summarize what I saw you write about in that article. And I want to start off with just, let's get clear on definitions, because you're talking about freedom, you're talking about sovereignty, and I think it's important to get clear on what is that actually. And as far as I read in your article, your definition of freedom was the ability to think, and then I added two words, but think, decide, speak, and act as one wants. Does that resonate? Is there anything you want to add to that, just on that definition level?
No, let's work with that.
Okay, perfect. And then I would love to get into this distinction you make in the article as freedom from and freedom to. And I would love for you to expand on that, and maybe using your background, because you gave poker as an example for freedom from, and travel kind of as an example for freedom to.
Yeah, so I think when a lot of people speak about freedom, they're generally speaking about one of those two things primarily, and not really both. And like specifically in terms of why it's harder than ever, at least, United States and I think probably worldwide, to have a conversation with people of, say, like different political values, persuasions, tribes, is, I think, a lot because the way freedom is discussed from, say, like a Republican, conservative, any of these label standpoint in the United States, it's generally a freedom from is kind of the language that is being used. Where I think to those that are, like the word liberal or progressive or Democrat, they're a lot more focused on freedom to. And when they hear people talking about freedom from, that's just not something that really resonates with them. For me, both the freedom from things and the freedom to do things is both important. Whether how that affects what a political system or government should look like, that's another conversation. But for myself, from a young age, I always felt very strongly about both. And freedom from was often freedom from teachers telling me to do things that I didn't want to do, that I didn't want to learn about. Parents and society telling me to go to school when I did not want to really go to school often. And so the freedom from was the freedom to be free of having to do those things. And I was lucky enough to find different things that kind of allowed me to have a degree of freedom from that, despite while still kind of not extricating myself from school and still going and graduating. But then also there was the freedom too, which is I wanted to do things that perhaps my parents did not want me to do, that were not allowed to be done by the school during school hours or even after school hours, but at the school. And that always felt kind of wrong to me. It felt like I should be able to do the things that I wanted to do. And this is all with the caveat, of course, that I do believe that you do have to be mindful of how these things affect other people. So if for me, fulfilling my freedom from or freedom to really impedes on the freedom and sovereignty, well-being, livelihood of other people, then that's a problem. And it's not a simple thing like everyone should have the freedom to do everything.
I mean, that's also just a very, very one-dimensional perspective on freedom. Is everybody should have the freedom to do everything, which is like, how would that work?
Yeah. But for myself, the things that I have as a younger kid that I wanted to do, at least from my perspective, never like hurt other people or impeded other people's sovereignty. And the freedom from the things that I didn't want to do, not doing those things wouldn't kind of violate someone else. They were just about me not trying to do those things. And so in the examples that you have there is, poker, which is something that I never like played poker full time for any long period of time, but I had definitely stretches while I was in college where I, played lots of cash game poker with the intention of, kind of making money. And the interesting thing about that poker lifestyle, which I might only have for a few days or a week at a time, actually with my partner Jack at Unbounded, where we'd kind of just go somewhere and play a ton of poker, which is there's no clocking in. You never have to go to the casino or go to the card game. You can go there whenever you want, and you can leave whenever you want. And there's a lot of professional poker players or kind of semi-professional poker players where it's a very appealing lifestyle where you could kind of live somewhat of like a degenerate style life, but still like make money doing something that at least at the beginning you love or enjoy doing. I don't think, and I think I maybe put a sense about this in the article, I don't think that is a good lifestyle and approach for long-term happiness and fulfillment. And I never, really did that over the long term, but even after like a week of playing a ton of poker, I'd be like, okay, this is enough. I don't need to keep doing this. I'm focusing too much on a card game and money, and it's kind of hard to be, I think, like live a grateful, spacious life if you're kind of hunched over at the casino all the time.
But at the same time,
yeah.
it is a very powerful image of really what it means to live a as much freedom from as potentially possible lifestyle, because you can have a poker game wherever there's a poker game. You can come, you can leave, and there's nobody telling you anything about it.
And I feel grateful I've been able to experience that. I hope others experience that or things like it. But I think it speaks to the limitations of just focusing on the freedom from, where, at least for what my idea of like a life well lived is like, playing poker all the time at the casino, or, buying a piece of land and not being part of society. That isn't that to me. I understand that might be for other people, and I respect that. And I hope that they are able to, live it, if they want to do that, live in a place that allows them to do that. But for me, and I think for most people, that wouldn't be what a life well lived looks like. And kind of conversely, on the other extreme, which is like freedom too, which is could perhaps the freedom for me, travel has always felt I've felt most free when traveling. It's especially when traveling to other countries, different cultures, different languages. It's much easier to, I think, realize how much of what you might take for granted, or what you kind of think, everyone thinks this is how humans operate, is really just a indicative of the people that you're spending time with and the culture that you're hanging around. So I often feel free when traveling, and the freedom to do new things is because I see other people doing different things and new things, and that gives me permission to try those things. Or there are things and patterns and habits that are kind of ingrained from being at home or being around a bunch of Americans for a sustained period of time, and then you go somewhere else, and then wow, okay, this is how other people are doing things, and maybe you don't even copy or try those things, but it allows you to get past that mental block you had around doing the thing that you wanted to do. I know from myself personally, there's kind of a lot of examples of that. And typically if I feel stuck doing some type of travel, even if it's just going, an hour to camp or do something in nature, makes me feel very free from like my mind and habits and the freedom to do new things in a way that doesn't happen for me, even with lots of meditation and other things, if I'm just like at the home that I'm based in.
So when I hear that, it seems like your map is, if we look at a society as you imagine it, is how can that society have as little as possible of putting people into boxes they don't want to be in, freedom from, and at the same time as much as possible of people can choose what to do, what to experience, what to try, so they can have as much freedom to do things as they want, but that's always open to their choosing because it's their freedom.
Exactly. Yeah, that would seem ideal to me. Getting there is difficult, and the kind of question of kind of how do you have abundance for a large amount of people, I think is a basically impossible to answer question, but I think some people have put a lot of thought into it and have better answers than others. But yeah, I think to have that type of society where you have kind of both freedoms, you need both, not kind of like a strong-armed government or political system, but you also need a degree of abundance for most people in society to have both the time and the resources to kind of to really explore things. And you could kind of go down this rabbit hole where, well, what if I want to do all these things and it's all crazy expensive? Well, I don't think we will ever have a world where everyone will have the freedom to do, say, things that today might cost hundred thousands or millions of dollars to do as like an experience or something. But I do think having that as a goal of just trying to get closer and closer to that, I think is a worthy goal personally.
And what's I think important in this discussion, because what we're actually talking about today is the goalpost. It's not necessarily the how-to. It's not these are the 10 steps to get there. It's what is our goalpost actually, and trying to get to that from also a fundamental perspective, because this is where we get into the sovereignty bit, because it seems like, so first we have the freedom to think, decide, act, speak, and act as one wants. And then the sovereignty bit of that would be actually recognizing that this is a natural and inalienable right that every person has.
I wouldn't necessarily use that language, which is like kind of rooted in like Christianity. I think that is a worthy goal. And I think that if we operate as if that is a natural right, I think that will generally result in a better society. But I don't think that's something that is, say, like a right. We're animals, we're humans, and the degree of freedom, wealth, abundance that we have today is better than it's ever been in history. It's exponentially better than it was 100 years ago, which is exponentially better than 100 years before that. So I wouldn't call it a right, but like in terms of a natural right, but a goal. But I think that operating as if it is a natural right produces good outcomes. So I'm okay with it, but just wanted to kind of make that distinction there.
Yeah, and I get the distinction, and it's actually a good one. And it's still, if we act as if it were a natural or a human right, then that's a good goalpost again to move towards. And I mean the question, and I think we have different paths on how to get there, and I'm just going to try to jump in it with you here, because we don't have that much time today, is how does that connect to Bitcoin? How do those two things, both the freedom and the sovereignty, connect to Bitcoin?
Well, there's a few obvious things that comes to mind, and I also want to preface before saying what these things are. There's also just a strong intuition around that, which is not going to be from my left brain, kind of logically how this plays out, but an intuition and a feeling that this is something that furthers, freedom and sovereignty. And similarly with how some of the smartest minds in the mid to late 90s that were building cutting edge things on the internet could probably barely fathom what the internet can do 10, 20 years later. That's, what I think would be the very charitable case for, what kind of my thoughts or what we would think at Unbounded about what's going to happen. Where like, even if we are, say, like on the cutting edge of this new revolution in how we store data and transmit value, the idea that we'd be able to know kind of all the effects of how this actually furthers it over a longer time horizon, I think would be kind of ridiculous. That being said, here are kind of the general areas that I'm excited about, knowing that I'm missing a lot. I think the micropayments, the nano payments, the ability to transact in small amounts really does allow people that otherwise wouldn't have access to a global financial system to have access to it. That today, the billions of people that don't have bank accounts, that aren't able to transmit value around the world, now that there's not, say, the infrastructure accompanying, say, the Bitcoin network or the BSV Bitcoin network to be able to do that. But I think that that is coming. People are working on it, and that is something that really excites me, which is kind of the freedom to be able to transact, to lend, to borrow in a way where access to capital for the billions of people that are unbanked is either non-existent or at incredibly onerous terms as it exists today. I think even for those not in, say, the developing world, there's tons of people in the developed world without access to bank accounts. So even the people not in that segment of the population, business models that require micro and nano payments, the ability to build businesses that take advantage of that, the ability to be a consumer of those things and have new types of experiences, that is now possible as well. So
actually that point is for those people who right now might be outside of the official payment and also data system that is connected to those payments. We're opening a whole world of freedom to do things that didn't exist beforehand.
Correct. And in some sense, if it's not really a choice or perceived as a choice, the freedom from like onerous lenders, whether it's the terms themselves or the lenders themselves. And there's lots, I think, of examples like that where it's not just the freedom to do new things, but it's a freedom from a way of being and a way of doing business that doesn't feel good to the people that are kind of on the wrong end of the stick there.
So they're also having more choice.
Yes.
Yeah. So that would be one of your points of.
But that's like, again, within encompassed in that, that's a huge point. And then the new types of business models where it's this compared to that, I'd say it might seem relatively trivial, but just the freedom for me to read whatever article I want to read without having to pay $200, $300, $400 in an annual subscription for this type of thing. The freedom for writers to be able to be read and compensated for their work. The freedom from having to choose between selling your album on your own personal blog or effectively giving it away for free on Spotify. The freedom to kind of set a price and have an experience for your listeners where they could listen to what you're doing, but you take a much higher percentage of the value that you're giving in this world. Something that I think about a lot as a serious musician and friends with many people that are active professional musicians where today all their income is coming from playing music and teaching music, is the the economics of being that type of artist and musician are just terrible. In and something in business you think about is, okay, you're going to create X amount of value in the world, and then you want to capture some fraction of it. The ratio of value that you capture as a musician is like the worst. You know, you put all this value, you create these incredible experiences for everyone, and besides the very, very top musicians, it's very difficult to make, you know, a living that can provide for like a family over the long term, where you can kind of be in an abundant mindset and save and all that, all those things that I think, from my perspective, are important to kind of living a life well lived with freedom. So I'm really excited for not just musicians, although that's the type of content creation and artistry that I'm most familiar with. I'm excited for what small payments and new ways of interacting online and in person can do for these different creators.
Mm-hmm. So, and I mean, I think the music one in that is kind of very intuitive for people to get, because I think most people have a sense that the business models around that we have right now are all shit, whether that's putting it on YouTube and then getting like half a cent for however many plays, Spotify, all of that, and having an actual workable model of how musicians could put their work onto the blockchain, and then whoever accesses it through whatever software, whether that's Spotify, whether that's Apple Play, whatever, compensates that musician who put the song there in the first place, is such a huge game changer. So, but as you said, it applies to so many different areas. It could be applied to science journals. It could be applied to all sorts of different business models that revolve around there's one version of this song and different apps can access it.
Yeah, and just be able to easily keep track of that. I'm very excited about that. I know there's a lot of kind of critics of the micropayment world, whether it's, you know, specifically BSV micropayments or just micropayments in general, which are, hey, you know, the model of giving away things for free and information wants to be free. That's where things should go. And right now we have that, and I don't think that people actually want something different. And I understand that, and I think we'll see how it plays out. But I know for myself personally, as a consumer, I would be very happy to, you know, pay small amounts to interact with kind of all of the content that I do. I mean, I already do to some degree, but the amount is very, very small, and majority of that value is going to that middleman, is going to that Spotify. It's not actually going to the artist itself. So, and a lot of that comes from the fact that the data siloing model of the Spotifys, the Netflixes, the Twitters of the world, that I think exists not because that's just the way that consumers want to interact with businesses and want it to be free. I think it's because we don't have a good ability to keep track of our data, to get liquidity and get a market price for what our data is worth, to be able to fight for a fair value for that data, to have brokers fighting on our behalf. And I think if we really understood the fact that these companies are taking really valuable data, keeping it just for themselves in a silo for their company, and perhaps the market price for that data is, you know, it varies for each person, but for us it could be tens, hundreds of dollars a month, where we would very happily pay $5-10 for the aggregated content that we use or to that service, but then we get to keep that valuable data. And then instead of that data going to this company, maybe we will sell to them, but we'll be choosing to sell to them where we have competition and options. So I think that you don't really have, it's really hard to have freedom without competition, I think. And yeah, I'm kind of going on a tangent here about
I mean, I actually think that,
but yeah.
which I think is its own place for freedom from and freedom to.
Yeah.
Like a freedom to interact with apps, companies in ways you choose, but also a freedom from being censored, having all your data collected, all of that. So it's completely own world of actually freedom. that I think probably, I mean, most people in the Western world have heard of, oh, data security, but I think very few people actually understand what it would mean to have freedom with our own data. So can you maybe expand a bit on that? Because I think it is such a fascinating rabbit hole.
Yeah, like today, the vast majority of our like valuable data is being mined for free by these different, major tech companies. And I am voluntarily doing that. It's there. I think people sometimes make the argument that, without real alternatives, Facebook and Twitter, it's not really a choice. It's a harder choice, but it still is a choice. Many people do decide not to use those platforms. I don't like that is the choice that I am making. I wish there was more competition, but I am making that choice. I am aware of it. And let me just think about this for a moment. What these companies are doing are taking information from you. They have some value to it. That they're not
from us and about us.
Yes,
it's
and
usually about us.
Yeah, and they put some value on it internally, which we don't really know. Maybe you read some of the 10Ks of the public companies and you can infer some things, but you don't really know what they think about your data specifically. And in a marketplace, the data of different people is going to be widely different and volatile. So our data has some value, but we don't really have a market price for it. There's no liquidity for our data. And a lot of that is because there's no way to standardize it or to see what it is worth. And that's also because there isn't a degree of like competition for buying and selling that data. And why is that? I think a lot of that is not because data doesn't want to be free, data doesn't want to be liquid. It's because until recently, we haven't had the technological bones to be able to do that. So something that I'm really excited about with Bitcoin is that I think data is by far the most undervalued and mispriced asset class in the world, and could potentially be the largest asset by market cap today if we actually had the liquidity and a true kind of fair market value for every person's in the world data. So if we had the ability to not necessarily put all that data, say, on the Bitcoin blockchain, but put hash of that data on chain to be able to access it, to be able to buy and sell it, and then instead of us going to the single Spotify, there's lots of different Spotify applications that are competing to provide a service for the data that's publicly available that we choose to toggle on and on. We could encrypt whatever parts we want to encrypt easily through some middleman company built on top of Bitcoin, where the net effect of what they charge is much less than, say, the existing kind of tech companies that are monopolizing and not really giving you a chance to understand what that data is worth. I think that's where we are going. And in our first ebook at Unbounded, we kind of talk about this in the first chapter as it relates to what kind of a Spotify evolving from where it is today to kind of lots of different Spotifys competing. And I think that's going to be the case for the Netflixes, the Twitters, all of these companies where the model is take data, don't let your customers know what the fair market value is, arb that really well, silo it, and as a result kind of build these huge companies where it's hard to compete. I think when the data is free and where we have the ability to decide, hey, do we want to allow them to look at our data? I mean, today, pretty much everyone uses these services, myself included.
Can you give me just one example for data? Because I think you're using data for a few different things.
Sure. But what I like, that simple. Like my interest as someone who spends a certain amount of money each year, as someone who manages businesses that spend a certain amount of money, the things that I like, that is an asset, because that's something that advertisers can use to sell to me. It's things that product managers and companies can use to build better products that are more tailored to me that I will then pay for. A lot of the valuable data that we have just comes down to what our different preferences are. And some of those preferences one can easily translate into products, some not so much. But today, pretty much everyone uses some of these platforms in some capacity. But I think many people don't like the fact that they do, but they still choose to do that. I don't think the world that I'm looking at is, okay, now everyone is keeping their data private because it's like easier to keep your data private. I think it's more that we're just getting a much better trade. So instead of more money going to, venture capitalists like me and, some of these founders that build companies that have data silos, more of that value is then staying with the end user, where now instead of trading, hundreds, thousands of dollars worth of data every month for a free service, you're now getting that money and then deciding how to pay for that. And we have a world where it's harder to build a bigger company, at least as it relates to companies that where proprietary data is a big part of the business model.
It's really fascinating to listen to you, because I'm not from the investment world, so I think a lot of the thoughts that for you are really natural to look at. Oh, there are these assets, and then you can trade them against this, and then. So I imagine that's how a lot of your thinking actually goes, because that's how you evaluate the worth and the value of businesses, etc. But it's like, me listening to you, I'm actually like, oh wow, that's so fascinating to think about. I'm constantly creating value because I use products, which creates data. And then I am potentially, with Bitcoin, responsible for that data. And I can actually choose how to use it, whether I give it away for free, whether I keep it private, whether I kind of sell it. But that can be then basically the privacy settings in the apps I use. So it's not like I have to go on and sell it to somebody, but it's the privacy settings will either pay me something, or they might ask me for
it
somebody,
could be very simple,
etc.
which is, do I want to keep this anonymous but still give it to them? Okay, that will give me $10 a month. Do I want to keep it not anonymous and give it to them? Well, that will give me $40 a month, and then you'll be free to choose whatever you'd like to do. And I still think that most people will choose to sell that data, but I think having the choice to do so and receiving better compensation for it is going to actually encourage more people to feel good about kind of this arrangement we have right now, where my sense of even people in tech that don't feel like they need to hide anything or okay with giving all their data, if I told them, hey, you could make another, $1,000, $10,000 a year by monetizing this, does this sound like a much better system to you? And I think they would say yes. It would perhaps make it much harder to build a successful tech company. I think the kind of the returns of just investing in early stage technology companies over the last 20 years is ridiculous. And I think that kind of arbitrage of just throwing a lot of money around at early stage technology companies won't be as good anymore. That's okay, because everyone will have kind of more of that, of the value that they're contributing in this world.
So as we're slowly wrapping up, I find this super fascinating, and I'm taking this as a very new thought that I've never entertained in this way with me, which is really this, because I've usually heard the story or the kind of theory that, oh, once people own their data, it's a lot of things will be private, and people and companies will not get all of this data anymore. And that's one possible future, that if you through the blockchain can actually own your data, you have the private keys, you may not share a lot of your private information with companies. But I actually like your alternative version of, maybe people will still use Facebook, Twitter the same way they do now, but they will actually get compensated for their usage. And just that could be an alternative version of where Bitcoin could take the future.
I think that's definitely where things are going. I think saying that like we're all going to decide to like most people keep their data private, I think is a little ridiculous. I think in general, information wants to be free. But again, kind of tying back to the original question here, there's freedom from and freedom to. And if you're just looking at freedom from, you miss out on all the freedom tos. So data wants to be free, but perhaps being most free means compensating it so that it could go farther places, and so that it could compensate the person that's creating that data, responsibly for it. So I think, when you're talking about, we'll still use Twitter, yeah, but there'll be a lot more competition at Twitter. So there'll be Twitch, and there'll be 10 other Twitch-like kind of interfaces. And then we won't mind as much when, say, perhaps the main one or even many of the main ones decide to, censor, Donald Trump or whoever else, because it's just so easy and trivial to use one of the other kind of applications for it. And when they're censoring the data, they're not literally deleting it forever. They're just not hosting it on their platform anymore, because the data kind of will be on Bitcoin forever.
So maybe we take that as the closing point here. Thank you very much for this insight into it seems like the investor's perspective on where Bitcoin could take us. So thank you very much. I found that very interesting.
Thanks for having me today, Lucas. Really appreciate it.